into the details, I'd like to thank you all on behalf of the NAMA Facility Technical Support Unit for your interest in our current call, the Ambition Initiative Round 2. And it's great to see so many different individuals joining us today. Briefly, I will walk you through the several goals that we have for today. Firstly, we'd like to highlight the resources on the NAMA Facility website that we have available to support applicants in preparing their outlines for this call. Secondly, we'd like to point out some key lessons learned from previous calls, looking at overall recommendations from all sectors. And thirdly, we'd like to take a deep dive on lessons learned in the agriculture, forestry, and other land use sector, also known as AFOLU, as well as recommendations. And we will be, I'll mention this several times today, but we will be taking questions later on when I indicate that it's time. And all questions sent to us either in the chat or by email will be included in our upcoming clarification notes to be published on the 23rd of February. Moving on, let's take a look at the structure for today. We have this webinar structured in 5 parts, and each of the different colleagues will be walking you through these different sections. I will firstly go into the technical overview, and then I will also present some of our highlighted resources from the NAMA Facility website. Then we will have Laura and Hélène go into the overall recommendations and lessons learned for the development of an NSP outline for all sectors. Then we'll have Laura and Johanna take a deep dive into the AFOLU sector, and then finally we'll get to the last part, which is commonly asked questions and audience questions. And now we'll just go into this technical overview. As you've probably noticed, we are still using MS Teams today. However, we're in a different format due to internal restrictions that we had. So we're no longer using a webinar tool or a live event format. We're now in a regular Teams call. So with that, it's very important that you try to adhere to our technical guidelines. Firstly, before we forget, we've distributed a brief anonymous survey in the chat. That's a participant survey. It shouldn't take very much of your time, and we ask that you fill that out before the end of this webinar. You have a control panel on the top right corner of your screen. So make sure that you keep yourself muted as is shown in this image. Do not unmute, otherwise you'll be distracting our speakers and other participants. And if you're an attendee, please make sure to keep your camera off and note that the session is being recorded currently. And finally, as we have a different format this time around, we ask that you kindly submit your questions in the chat when requested. Or via email, as we will collect them and ensure that they are covered in the upcoming clarification notes. And now I will guide you to this next section on highlighted resources from the NAMA Facility. So here you see that the NAMA Facility, next slide please. The NAMA Facility has a wealth of resources. Since we can't cover everything in this webinar, we do encourage you to check them out. So we have application documents related to the Ambition Initiative Round 2 call on the website. You can also access previous webinar recordings, for example, from the 7th call. And in addition, we have various documents and publications on several topics that might be of interest to you, for example, on transformational change, sustainable development co-benefits, things that or do's and don'ts, things you've always wanted to learn about the NAMA Facility, and FAQs and clarifications. So make sure that you check those out. And as briefly stated before, while the call is still open, the TSU typically collects questions regarding the Ambition Initiative Round 2 and publishes them under clarifications and FAQs on our website. So if you do have any questions, please send them to us by email. Clarification notes are published every 3 to 4 weeks. And we've already published 2 rounds on December 20th and February 2nd, and our next round will be coming up on the 23rd of February. So in 1 week, we'll be doing that. And bear in mind that while the TSU will not provide clarification on the interpretation, will provide clarification on the interpretation of the GID, that's our general information document, or application documents, we will not be providing any NSP specific advice, such as individual NSP concepts or proposed partnership structures. And that's just to ensure that we have a transparent and fair competitive call process. And with this, just one final reminder, we also have our next clarifications being published on 23rd of February. We have another webinar on the 23rd of March. I'll be providing this reminder again towards the end of the webinar. And if you would like to get any updates on these, make sure to follow our social media handles, as you can see here, our Twitter and LinkedIn. And with that, I'd like to hand the word over to my colleagues, Laura and Hélène.
Thank you, Halina, and a warm welcome to everybody also from my side. Moving on to this next section, Elena and I will now look and guide you into 9 recommendations that you should consider when drafting your NSP outline. However, before we do that, I would like to emphasize that none of the examples that we'll be providing you with should be taken as a blueprint of how to undertake the specific recommendations we will be guiding you through. Keep in mind that any activity should always be tailored to a specific context of your NXP. Having said that, and without further ado, I'm happy to hand over the word to my colleague Hélène, who will walk us through the first recommendation. On to you, Hélène.
Thank you, Laura. A first point that we would like to raise is that you should conduct market studies and stakeholder interviews as part of developing your project outline. This will allow you to better understand the conditions on site and tailor your support to the real needs of the target groups of your NSP. As an example, if you're interested in developing an outline in the electric mobility space, you should have a thorough understanding of the current market size for electric vehicles, as well as the status quo technology, namely internal combustion engine vehicles. The market research and stakeholder interviews that you conduct should also give you an idea of the potential future market size of the desired technology. As such, you should be able to know the extent to which the target sector is able and willing to pay for the technology, who are the main stakeholders, what are their specific needs and vested interest, if the policy framework supports the deployment of the necessary infrastructure and technology, and if the suppliers are in the position to provide quality services beyond selling the technology, such as operation and maintenance services or replacement of components. Being able to answer all of these questions will help you make much more informed decisions when it comes to the design of your project. The proper place to integrate and showcase results of studies and interviews conducted for your NSP is section 2.1 of the NSP Outline template, which is the barrier analysis. Market studies will also influence calculations and information provided in Annex 5A and 5B. With this, I pass it over to Laura for the next recommendation.
Thank you, Hélène. A second recommendation relates to the description of the barriers. When describing barriers, make sure to not only consider financial and/or political hurdles, but also social and behavioral ones. For example, imagine you are dealing with the waste sector. In this case, when referring to social and behavioral barriers, it would be important to address the behavior and customs of the local population when it comes to waste management. It might be the case that households sell recyclables to the informal sector. This would be a behavioral barrier that an NSP intervening in the municipal solid waste management sector would have to deal with. Another example in the energy sector relates to clean cook stoves, where the target group might be attached to the status quo technology, namely open fire stoves, due to cultural reasons. For example, because the open fire stove represents a place of family reunion, or because of the smoky flavor it provides the food with. Also, keep in mind to dig deeper and to try to identify the very root of the problem. When describing the barriers, try to avoid generic formulations like lacking access to commercial financing or risk aversion, and focus instead on what exactly is hindering this access, both from the financial landscape and from the perspective of the target group. One example would be to investigate whether financial institutions have suitable due diligence procedures in place that will allow them to assess the mitigation technology and provide financing. Another example would be to understand the hurdles faced by NSPs dealing with different target subsegments, for example, the formal and informal sector. The latter might face a lack of access to financing due to lack of collateral, while this might not be the case of the formal sector. In the outline template, you would describe the barriers identified as precisely and specifically as possible in section 2.1 under barrier analysis. With this in mind, I give the word back to you, Ellen, for our third recommendation.
Thank you, Laura. A third recommendation is to remember that every solution, every mitigation technology and practice will necessarily have a supply and a demand side. You should therefore consider the barriers, needs, vested interest, behaviors, economic conditions, and choices of both sides when conceptualizing the NSP outline. Even if your NSP will focus only on supply or demand, remember that on the ground, you will inevitably have to deal with both. So for example, imagine that your NSP is in the energy sector and is aimed at disseminating solar photovoltaic systems for small and medium-sized enterprises. You might first look at the target market, namely the small and medium-sized enterprises, to understand what their barriers are, their needs, etc. However, for your NSP to be successful, it is important to know early on whether the suppliers of such technology have the capacity to ramp up production and keep up with an increased demand. Opportunities and challenges associated with supply and demand will trickle down into section 2.1, barrier analysis, since you will be considering both sides when analyzing and describing the main barriers, as well as section 2.3, project concept, where you should address some of the barriers identified. Laura will now get you through our fourth recommendation.
Thank you, Ellen. The fourth recommendation is to consider the entire life cycle of the mitigation technology or practice that the NSP will be promoting. Try to answer whether the mitigation technology may create adverse environmental and/or social impacts in its post-use phase, or whether the mitigation technology or practice will create additional environmental and/or social burdens when substituting a business-as-usual technology or practice. What can the NSP do to mitigate the negative impact? Try to highlight it. Let's stick to the previous example of the successful deployment of solar photovoltaic systems with batteries. When these new systems are installed, what will happen to the old ones? How will they be collected and disposed of? Furthermore, what will happen once the new systems fulfill their life cycle? Can some older components be replaced to extend its lifetime? Or on the contrary, can functioning parts of decommissioned systems be upcycled, for example, batteries? How will those components containing hazardous substances, such as batteries, be disposed of? Of course, all these questions need to be answered with the support of a suitable legislative framework and sufficient enforcement capacity from the government. The appropriate place to mention all of these aspects in the NSP outline would be the NSP outline template under section 2.3, project concept. Back to you, Ellen.
Thank you. Our fifth recommendation is about considering how the NSP can contribute to achieving gender equality. Gender equality refers to the absence of discrimination on the basis of a person's sex in terms of rights, opportunities, allocations of resources and benefits, or access to services. Promoting gender equality is not only a matter of human rights and social justice, but a precondition for sustainable development. And in this regard, it is important to bear in mind that the NAMA facility finances projects that trigger transformational change towards low-carbon sustainable development in all of its forms, being environmental, social, and economic. But what do we mean by gender mainstreaming for climate change? Climate change impacts men and women differently, largely due to their different powers, roles, and responsibilities in societies. Gender mainstreaming is therefore the process of assessing and responding to the differentiated implications of any planned climate action on men and women. It is not simply about adding a women's component to an existing or planned activity or increasing women's participation. It is about modifying climate and development interventions so that they can truly benefit men and women equally. As such, it is important for proposed projects to ensure that the perception, interest, and needs of both men and women will be given equal weight in the planning of activities. To illustrate this with an example, If we take the AFOLU sector, some activities like coffee production are often traditionally dominated by men. As such, it is important for your project to understand from the onset the specific roles that men and women play in the sector through a gender mainstreaming analysis, for example, and to uncover underlying power dynamics. You should also find ways to promote the participation of female coffee producers, for example, through capacity buildings or trainings, and to make sure that financial mechanisms developed also respond to their needs. Attaining and recording data that is segregated by gender will also be key to measure results and identify effective methods. You will want to consider this point as part of the NSP's technical assistant package, which should be described in section 2.3, project concept. The NAMA facility is proactively looking into this topic, so we recommend that applicants pay attention to gender equality from an early stage when developing their project outline. With this, I will pass it back to you, Laura.
Thank you, Ellen. Our sixth recommendation is that the key starting point of the development of your NSP concept must be a cost-effective and significant maximization of the mitigation of greenhouse gas emissions. To demonstrate that, thoroughly consider and describe alternative mitigation technologies that could have been applied and explain why these were not chosen. Please remember that in order to realize any mitigation potential, the uptake needs to be first successful. So keep in mind factors such as the market maturity level of the technology as well as the suppliers. Apply the same approach to financial instruments. Thoroughly consider and describe alternatives as well as explain why these proved to be less efficient and were therefore rejected by the NSP. Please note that the requirement of considering alternative mitigation technologies is applicable to all NSPs independently from whether they're piloting new technologies or not. Alternative financial instruments or combinations of these should also be considered and described, making an explicit link to the barriers of the target segment and the available financial market conditions. For example, liquidity of banks, lending conditions, amongst many others. Always keep in mind that the aim of the NSP is to be as cost-efficient and cost-effective, which means that the NSP should strive to maximize the volume of greenhouse gas emission reductions per euro of the NAMA facility funding. To sum up, we would like to understand why you chose both your technology and your financial mechanism, and what are their advantages compared to other available options. All these considerations will flow into the description of your NSP as part of section 2.3 and as part of Annex 5A, where you will be asked to shortly describe alternative financial mechanisms that were considered but that in the end were rejected. Back to you, Ellen, for our next recommendation.
Our seventh recommendation is to describe specific lessons learned from other projects or activities in the sector, subsector in which your NSP would intervene in. Consideration of the lessons learned will help you design the NSP better and consider the pitfalls that other projects or activities have come across in the past. It also serves as an indicator that the NSP team was in conversation with other projects and initiatives in the sector and considered their learnings already at the outline stage. In the case of NSPs dealing with the base of the pyramid target segment, for example, as might be the case of the AFOLU or waste sectors, the collection of data at the preparatory phase of the NSP concept might be difficult. It is therefore recommended to leverage any available data from related organizations or project partners, as well as establish contact with other projects early on to inform the design of your NSP. A suitable space for demonstrating that the lessons from other projects and activities have been collected and considered would be section 2.4, embedding of the NSP outline template. So with this, I'll give the word back to Laura once again.
Thank you, Ellen. We only have 2 recommendations left, so let's move on to our 8th recommendation. This slide could be summarized under the point, realistic assumptions behind the NSP approach. Please keep in mind to apply realistic assumptions to changing policy frameworks. This is very important because changes to policy frameworks may require a lot of time and complicated procedures. In some countries, key laws are actually only reviewed every few years, so please be realistic on what this means in terms of the NSP timeline. Also, do consider the culture of non-payment. Fees and taxes may not be collected in a manner that the NSP expects to. This is especially relevant in the context of provision of public services, for example, in the waste sector. Another relevant example is the AFOLU sector, where there might be payment delays due to crop cycle changes. Consider how these changes would affect your business model and be realistic in your expectations. Needless to say, this same thing applies to the timeline to be proposed under the DPP concept. Take into account that the NSP may experience delays to bureaucratic procedures in place. These various points can be fed into the sections 2.1 and 2.3, the annexes 5A and 5P, and of course, the DPP and its potential hurdles might find their place in Annex 4A. I'll give the word back to you, Helen, for our last recommendation.
Thank you. As our final recommendation, we advise you to keep realistic assumptions in mind when setting up your mitigation scenario. Let's first take a look at the feasibility of the mitigation scenario. Remember that NSPs will need to set up procedures and agreements with partners prior to starting implementation. This would usually take place in implementation phase 1, which is up to 18 months. So emission reductions starting straight from the first year implementation are usually unlikely. Secondly, try to have realistic and justifiable technology lifetimes. An example from our day-to-day life would be the lifetime of appliances. It would be considered realistic if the NSP applies an average lifetime of 15 years to an initially energy efficient fridge rather than 20 or 25 years. Finally, you should also take into consideration the effects of rebound and leakage. Even if the NSP cannot quantify the rebound and leakage effects, it would be important to list them to showcase that the problem is not overlooked by the NSP. All of the aspects will be considered in your calculation of the mitigation scenario and Annex 6, greenhouse gas emissions mitigation potential, and will also be presented in the NSP Outline template in section 3.3 mitigation ambition. A last point with regards to the mitigation scenario is that the NAMA facility recently revised Annex 6 of the outline document, which is the greenhouse gas emission potential annex, and is currently still revising its associated guideline. Annex 6 now incorporates a checklist which guides applicants through must-have information and controls if they have filled in the required data in the correct format. The revised NAMA facility mitigation guideline will include an additional appendix on the waste sector and be aligned with Annex 6. Small changes to Annex 6 are still being done to incorporate references to the mitigation guideline. So both documents, both the revised mitigation guideline and Annex 6, will be available on the website on the 18th of February under application documents. Having finished this section on recommendations, I will now give the word to my colleagues Johanna and Laura for the second part of this webinar.
Yeah, thank you very much, Helen. And hi, everyone. I'm Johanna. I'm a desk officer at the NAMA facility. And I'm also the sector lead for the AFOLU sector, namely the agriculture, forestry, and land use sector here at NAMA facility. I will guide you through the next section together with my colleague Laura. And during this time, we will take a deep dive of the lessons learned of the AFOLU sector here at NAMA facility by exploring a few observations, common pitfalls, and lessons learned we have identified in various outlines submitted over the last course at NAMA facility, so 8 calls and counting. The motivation behind zooming into the AFOLU sector relates to one of our core principles here at NAMA facility, which is that we want to create and share lessons learned. Well, unfortunately, we don't have a lot of time, but some, so we will not go to all of the section like in extreme detail. However, we are very happy to share with you that we will also publish a paper on this topic later at the end of February, and we will elaborate a little bit more on some of the content in there, and we warmly invite you to also read this paper and check it out on our website, and also share any comments you might have for us as well. Yeah, and with that, I want to highlight the words of my colleague Laura, actually. Once again, our intention here is that sharing this input is providing with some guidance, which might help you during the outline process. However, it is absolutely crucial that you always keep the specific context and narrative of your NSP in mind. And in our experience, there's really never a silver bullet for any NSP. So in this sense, please always remember to adjust any information to the NSP context, and no recommendation should be taken as a one-to-one generic solution. With that being said, let's just jump into the topic. First up is ambition, and within it, transformational change. Laura, imagine NSP is writing its outline. What do you think they should absolutely keep in mind when contemplating transformational change?
Thanks a lot, Johanna. Well, I would say that given the fact that the majority of AFOLU sector NSPs target mostly smallholder farmers, in order to trigger transformational change, it is crucial that interventions are coordinated and scaled up, interlinking the local, regional, and national government policy framework. It is not enough for a country to have a highly developed policy framework at the national level if there is no good implementation of policies on the ground. This is especially relevant in countries with limited governance capacity and where there are several levels of government. Having said that, perhaps two of the most important points to keep in mind are, first, to consider the legal framework and the status quo of law enforcement within the forestry sector, taking special note of the land tenure situation in the context. This will be fundamental when designing the scheme. Secondly, keep in mind that environmental, for example, biodiversity, and social safeguards, for example, land rights, warrant a specific consideration. Lastly, and linking it back to the point that I just mentioned, keep in mind potential trade-offs and feedbacks that might occur between greenhouse gas mitigation and other important factors such as food security, biodiversity, and the earling of livelihoods. Also, the design of AFOLU interventions should ideally be user-centric and based on participatory engagement design, as this can improve effectiveness. What we mean by this is that NSPs should strive to include farmers in the design process of financial mechanisms and any other instruments that might be derived from the project to really address their needs, vested interests, and in that way facilitate the scalability and sustainability of the intervention. Another important point is that AFOLU interventions heavily rely on the long-term adoption of climate-friendly activities by the target group, which goes beyond just adopting technologies. In this context, behavioral change is essential and must be appropriately emphasized in the NSP design. Finally, when pondering timelines, it is important that NSPs consider the different factors that could delay the project. For example, misalignment of production cycles, pilots, difficulties in fostering behavioral change, and securing buy-in of stakeholders such as government officials, farmer associations, and financial institutions, amongst others. Please, once again, to repeat myself from the last section, be realistic about the timelines and the amount of previous work which already should happen at the preparation phase of the NSP concept. Let's continue with the second sub-criteria of ambition, and that is financial ambition. Tell me, Johanna, what are the absolute do's and don'ts of this area of the outline?
Yeah, thank you, Laura. That was quite a comprehensive answer. So regarding your question about financial mechanisms, as you rightfully just mentioned, oftentimes NSPs in the AFOLU sector target smallholder farmers. This segment faces a series of challenges that often hinders capacity to access sources of finance, for example, due to a lack of collateral, low levels of financial literacy, and even low trust in financial institutions. As a background information, maybe, the severity of these hurdles is so acute that the World Bank estimates that globally less than 10% of smallholder farmers have access to finance. Well, furthermore, the revenue stream of this group is highly dependent on crop cycles, which are prone to delays due to adverse weather events, changing climate patterns, pests, and others. These occurrences and delays further reinforce the unbankable perception from the side of the financial institutions. As a consequence, NSPs should have a clear picture of the landscape of relevant financial actors which have already come in contact with the target market and offer suitable financial mechanisms. They should consider production cycles, risks and cash flow challenges, and potential lack of traditional collateral. Some relevant examples would be microfinance institutions, so-called cajas rurales, credit cooperatives, and others, of course. Well, regarding the last point, it is very important that financial mechanisms designed within the framework of the NSP align with lending and harvesting cycles. Finally, due to the financial barriers previously mentioned, NSPs should ideate setups that facilitate financial leverage through forms of private sector engagement. These could be, but obviously do not have to be, the use of remittances, savings book approach, microfinancing, amongst many others. Related to this, and in order to facilitate the uptake of financial mechanisms designed within the NSP, it is recommended that these build on existing structures which are close to farmer organizations, ideally with established business relations. So those could be farmer associations, processing companies, service providers, and many more. So I think this covers some relevant points related to financial ambition. Now let's jump to the next one, mitigation potential, which we all know is particularly tricky for the AFOLU sector. Which insights do you have for applicants which might make this a bit easier, Laura?
Thank you, Hannah. Well, let's begin with the most important one and I again will echo what Elena and I were saying beforehand. Make sure that mitigation is the focus of the outline. Having said that, here at the NAMA facility, we are aware that quantifying the mitigation potential of AFOLU NSPs can be a challenge, as compiling the data can be cumbersome, or it might be the case that it's not readily available. Given the complexity of this task, it is recommended that NSPs make sure to allocate enough time to collect the necessary data during the preparatory phase of the outline, and where possible to leverage access to such information from project partners or public officials, which might have the information readily available, for example, in the framework of the update of nationally determined contributions, just to give an idea. If all the information cannot be provided, this should be adequately acknowledged and factored in at the early stage of the NSP, for example, in the detailed preparation phase. Furthermore, NSPs must ensure to avoid deforestation to not hinder the mitigation potential. Another very important point linked to this of avoiding deforestation is that NSPs should adequately assess and give an overview of potential rebound effects and leakage risks and propose appropriate risk mitigation measures. Even if this information is not readily available, please do not ignore it, as we want to see that the problem is not being overlooked. Another very important point is that oftentimes NSPs in this sector propose the creation of a monitoring, reporting, and verification system as a side activity to be done during a very short period of time. The design of an implementation of an FRB system is a time-consuming and complex endeavor. Thus, we highly encourage that NSPs identify potential synergies with the available policy framework, for example, the National RED+ strategy, if it's already there, at an early stage before proposing the creation of an MRB system from scratch. Furthermore, because the capacities built in the design of MRB systems can be replicable in other sectors, there is space for a lot of synergies. So keep in mind this. With this last part, we conclude the ambition part and now can jump to the first subsection of feasibility, and that is project rationale. Back to you, Johanna. Please share with our audience what makes a strong project rationale.
Yeah, thank you, Laura. So yeah, to your question, well, one of the most occurrences we see in the sector related to project rationale is that oftentimes AFOLU NSPs propose multiple intervention approaches and or also sometimes cross-sectoral technologies. An example would be proposing an agriculture project combined with the deployment of clean energy technologies, or by proposing a variety of technologies simultaneously. To make this a bit more tangible, so just imagine your NSP proposes the deployment of seedlings, live fences, and solar irrigation systems. Well, naturally, the former will take much longer to become operational in terms of their mitigation potential than the latter. Well, as a consequence, my first recommendation for this would be for NSPs to make sure to align the different time horizons of such a setup across the outline, the detailed preparation phase, and of course also the business plan. Another point which we would also like to raise here would be the one of labeling and certification. When proposing such a scheme, make sure to provide a rationale, consider the timing, and also set realistic assumptions. And always, if possible, of course, make sure to use existing structures which are already in place in the country context. Also, something else to keep in mind is to define the target group and any potential different subgroups that may be relevant. So you would have to adjust the barrier analysis accordingly, of course. So for example, the needs of beef and milk farmers are not the same. The needs of farmers in the formal and informal sector are not the same, and so on. Of course, we could list a few other examples here as well. And yeah, so maybe to wrap up the section, I would like to emphasize what was mentioned before. Please be realistic with timelines and remember to leverage synergies. And yeah, with this, we're actually slowly but surely reaching the end of the section. Well, back to you, Laura. And now please walk us through your tips for the project design.
Thank you, Johanna. Indeed, we're slowly approaching the end of this section. So regarding project design, as we mentioned earlier, and please don't think that we're a broken record, but we really think that some of the points that we're repeating are worth emphasizing, and this is one of them. And this relates to the fact that, for example, in the case of the AFOLU sector, it is common that sometimes establishing the baseline emissions of smallholder farmers might not be super easy, as it might be very cumbersome, the data might be unreliable, and so on. Due to this, there is a risk that this will lead to setting false and impossible target values. Therefore, my recommendation would be to try to collect or validate necessary data from project partners and other similar projects. In this way, you will save valuable time and resources. If some information is missing, again, don't forget to factor that in your project design. Another key point, which is very specific to the AFOLU sector, is the need to adequately frame the narrative. Although for the NAMA facility, and consequently for the NSP, the focus should always remain in mitigation. The reality is that for a lot of farmers, climate change adaptation tends to be more relevant. Therefore, consider this when approaching the target group. And this goes hand in hand with our suggestion earlier that you should consider the needs, vested interests, and abilities, among many other factors of the target sector, so that your project actually caters and delivers to their needs. These will help and guarantee the sustainability and scalability of the scheme. And with this, let's jump to our last section, and that is the detailed preparation phase concept. What do you think NSP should have in mind when designing this first but crucial part of their project, Johanna?
Yeah, thank you, Laura. So you just mentioned it. DPP stands for the Detailed Preparation Phase here at NAMA facility. Keep in mind that for Ambition Initiative 2, this is 10 or 15 months long. And the focus of this DPP should be to consolidate and complete processes, such as stakeholder engagement, collecting baseline information data, understanding your market. However, of course, in order to produce a good outline, some of that preparatory work should have already been done for the design of the outline. And one thing really crucial to keep in mind, and again, we mentioned a few times in the webinar, please keep realistic timelines in mind also for the DPP. And yeah, with that, I think we're done with our recommendations for the AFOLU sector for today. Again, as mentioned, we're going to publish a paper on our website, so please see our website at the end of February. We do hope those recommendations were helpful for you. Thanks a lot for your attention and good luck with your outlines, and back to Helena.
Yes, thank you, Laura, Helen, and Johanna for providing applicants with overall recommendations for all sectors to prepare their outlines better and providing a deeper look into the AFOLU sector. And now we will be moving into the last part of our webinar, which is firstly, we're going to be looking at commonly asked questions. Yes, let's look at the first commonly asked question. This one is related to the AFOLU sector, and therefore Laura will be a good candidate to answer this question for us. The question reads, is it eligible for an NSP in the forestry sector to generate carbon credits for emissions credits? Laura, over to you.
Thank you, Helena. Well, the answer to this question is that generally, the NAMA facility funding may be used for the generation of emission reduction certificates for the voluntary market, insofar as they are of good quality, verifiable, and demonstrably used to ensure the sustainable funding of climate protection projects in the field of agriculture, forestry, or land use. However, in order to ensure the additionality of greenhouse gas reductions and of the donor's contribution to international climate finance, no emission certificates or other emission credits, such as certified emissions reductions and verified emission reduction credits generated by NSPs may be traded on the market, either during or after the NSP term. Certificates generated with the support from a NAMA facility must be permanently cancelled. Back to you, Halina.
Thank you, Laura, for answering that for us. Now we'll move on to the second question. I'll just wait for that one to come up. Thank you so much. So the question reads, one of the NAMA facility selection criteria is the financial ambition. In the GID, General Information Document, section 5.1.3 Outline Assessment Criteria, the criterion is further specified, and amongst others, it is mentioned that significant private sector participation is expected. Can you please further elaborate if private sector participation is a mandatory feature of NSPs? Hélène, would you be able to take on this question for us?
Yes, of course, Helena. So to answer this, no, a private sector participation is non-mandatory for the NSPs. However, the financial ambition, both in terms of public and private funding leverage, is seen as key for triggering the transformational change towards a carbon neutral development pathway. In both cases, the financial leverage is assessed relative to the sector and the country. Therefore, the NAMA facility does not set a minimum threshold for the private and public leverage. It is important to demonstrate how the mitigation technology and practice proposed in the NSP will be financed and showcase that the NSP will create favorable market conditions for further uptake and upscaling of the mitigation technology or practice. Usually, a certain level of private sector engagement is needed to create this effect and to ensure that all relevant stakeholders are involved in the transformation. With this, back to you, Halina.
Thank you, Hélène, and we'll move to the last commonly asked question, number 3. So for NSPs focusing on novel technologies, A, what is the time limit to move from the pilot phase to the large-scale project? B, will there be an additional decision point before moving to the large-scale project? An example, will the results from the pilot phase determine if the NSP can proceed to the next phase? And this one, if you could answer it, Johanna, that would be great.
Sure, Halina. So yeah, this is one of our clarification questions, and the response is as follows. So for the first sub-question, the NSPs have to shift to the large-scale project within the NSP's lifetime. In the outline documents, applicants are requested to formulate key milestones associated with smaller scale pilot phases that need to be achieved before moving into the large-scale project phase. The specific milestones and criteria for the 2 stages will be determined as part of the in-depth assessments. So regarding the second sub-question, of course, there's a substantial number of novel technologies that could be piloted as part of an NSP. So some examples could be grid-scale battery storage, low-emission steel and cement in the built environment, approaches in organic and low-input farming, or also industry decarbonization. So, for example, in the cement, steel, or chemicals or plastics industry. Yeah, and back to you, Halina.
Thank you, Johanna, and to all three of you for helping us with that. And now finally, we will get to the audience section. So if we could switch the slide here, yes, we have a few guidelines here this time due to the different format. Firstly, there's one clarification question here. So if there are any clarification questions that are just related to the content, you're free to add them to the chat and we can see if one of our speakers can take them. Otherwise, generally, if you have any questions that are related to the call in general or broader, please add them to the chat and we will be collecting them as part of the clarification notes that will be submitted or uploaded to the website on the 23rd of February. In addition, you can also email us your questions at contact@namafacility.org and you can expect a personal reply as well. So please, yes, we'll give you a few moments to add your questions in the chat. And we'll see if any of the speakers can take this one that has been submitted. If a private contribution is given for leverage, do you need to prove the contribution or is the application stage a letter of intent sufficient? Yeah, if anyone is able to take that one. And otherwise, for the rest of you, please, we'll just be waiting for your questions to be added in the chat so that they can be collected by my colleagues.
Yeah, maybe I can take one of those. So there was one question, which was, if a private contribution is given for leverage, do you need to prove the contribution or is the application stage a letter of intent sufficient? Yeah, thank you for that question. I think it's something that a lot of applicants are wondering really. And what we would expect at this stage, so outline stage, would be endorsement letters, basically. So we kind of see that there's really an intent to deliver that financial leverage. So yeah, hopefully that answer is helpful.
Thank you, Johanna. So I believe we will just, yes, we'll be collecting the rest of these questions and you should expect to see them as part of the clarifications and FAQs in approximately a week. So thank you, everyone. You can keep adding your questions there and they will be collected. In addition, I would just like to remind those of you who are latecomers to this webinar, there was a brief and anonymous participant survey that was distributed. So please fill that out. It will be copied again towards the end of this webinar. So just making sure that we, yes, capture some participant information. Now we're almost at the end of the webinar. So let's just briefly look at what is coming next. So yes, please mark your calendars for the third and final webinar of our Ambition Initiative Round 2 webinar series. That's going to be taking place on the 23rd of March. Clarification and FAQs is the topic for that one. And here again are all the dates for the upcoming clarification notes. So yeah, quite a few are coming up. And just another reminder, we'd like to point you to our website. We have a dedicated page for the Ambition Initiative Round 2 call. And in addition, if you have any questions, you are always free to email us. You can also follow our updates on our Twitter account or join our LinkedIn group as well. And just a friendly note to remember that we will have this AFOLU paper that is coming up towards the end of the month. So keep an eye on our communications channels for that. And a last item is just if you know anyone who's interested in applying to the Ambition Initiative Round 2, to please share this information with them. Again, the webinar recording will be uploaded along with the slides in just a few days. So keep your eyes out. And don't forget that the submission deadline is the 30th of April. And finally, thank you so much on behalf of the TS you at the NAMA facility. We look forward to seeing you at our third and final webinar, and we're really excited to see your outline submissions.